There's metaphysical dualism. You're probably familiar with this, right? There's yin and yang, Manichaeism, Gnosticism, and there's all sorts of dualities you're going to find across history and various mythologies and all that kind of bullshit. You're going to find that the world is being represented in opposites, right? The way most people interpret this is two metaphysically positive entities that contradict one and another. This is the most important one. Sexual difference. Man, woman, masculine, feminine. This is the primary means by which metaphysical dualism is given expression in relation to some kind of sexual difference. Why is there metaphysical dualism? Now, in today's universities, you have an attack against binary logic, favoring pure multiplicity and pure diversity instead. The binary for them is just 1 plus 1. So they asked a simple question. Why must there be 1 plus 1 when we can have 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1? Why 1? Why not 2? Why 2? Why not 3? Why not 4? Why not 5? Why not 6, for example? This is the basic, and then you're going to see this kind of logic expressed in other places, even in physics. What do you have? You have many worlds theory, and then in analytical philosophy, you have another type of many worlds. There's many possible languages and many possible worlds and many possible whatever. You know, it's like it's this privileging of multiplicity, right? Over binaries. Well, that is arbitrary, isn't it? Why not 3? Why not 4? Why not 5? Why 2? Why 2? Why 2? Well, I'll tell you what. This is a big misunderstanding. The unity of opposites relevant to dialectics is... Yeah, the mind-body difference, Daniel. That's a really big one. Mind-body dualism is one you guys are probably familiar with as well. And that's also sexed and gendered, right? Body is female and mind is masculine. You got the logos and you have Sophia. You have all sorts of different... That's Gnosticism and all that kind of stuff. The mind-body one is, I think it's very prevalent across the history of humanity, but it's given fullest expression, I think, through Gnosticism, and then Gnosticism culminating in Descartes, and that's what's critiqued as binary logic in the universities. It is not that metaphysical dualism is arising out of an arbitrary imposition of just privileging 2 ones. Because in that case, why not 3? Why not 4? Why not 5? Why not 6? Yeah, base versus superstructure is another one. Which is also why, in most ways people use base versus superstructure, it's undialectical. Dialectics, it always begins with 1. There is always a striving and an orientation to what is ultimately one thing. You've got one thing first. 2 merely is the most initial expression given to the fact that metaphysical dualism is never actually an arbitrary unity of 2 ones. It's always trying to give expression to this primordial distinction, if you will, its own otherness. This otherness is that one. This otherness, proper to the one, is the one estranged from itself somehow. The form and the content, for example. The other is going to be the objective response you're going to get in that pursuit. You're going to pursue, for example, an ideal self, and reality is going to spit out something completely different than what you expected to be your ideal self. That is the expression of the otherness. It is only when there's a response to you that it's an otherness. Is this like the essence of something and the appearance? Sure, that's another way of putting it. The essence and the appearance. One and its otherness. Now, why do we begin with 1? Why does 1 begin with 1? I just said it. I just said why. Why begin with 1? Because 1 is a determinate singular way. Our object is always one, insofar as our speech, our thoughts, our mind is determinate and itself singular. In a sense, ontology is monotheistic itself. When we ask what is being, we're asking what is something. What is a something? That something is ultimately implied as one something, one being, right? Being itself confronts us as one thing. And even when we divide it into several things, that's only insofar as those several things bear witness to the fact that there cannot just be one thing. There's multiple because there cannot just be one. For example, I wanted to clarify this about metaphysical dualism. The difference between masculine and feminine, in contrast to what they teach you in the American universities, for example, there's no transphobia on my part. I'm not like Paul Cockshot or whatever, but I'm going to just say this because anyone who's saying otherwise is lying. This difference between metaphysical dualism between masculine and feminine is giving rise, is the very expression, for example, of a dialectic between form and content, between night and day, for example, darkness and light, body and mind. These distinctions are proper to every human civilization. Now, all human other civilizations do have a sense of multiplicity and so on, but this multiplicity is ultimately coming from branching out from this original difference. A person and their addressee in this case isn't another person, but is nature. Another example of otherness is nature itself. Okay? Now, here's something else I want to say. Within the standpoint of a single person, a single subject, a single speaker, a single thinker, what you are, what your being is, for example, is not known to you, is only revealed to you by means of the other. The other is the site at which what you are can be revealed to you. Why do you guys think people go on the internet and seek attention? Because we don't know what we are, fundamentally. We search for other people to reveal what we ourselves are. That's why we go on the internet and we type on lefty pole, for example, even though we're anonymous, because we want to type something and we want to see how people are going to respond to us. And that's going to reveal to us what we are, because we don't know what we are. There's also Heidegger's foreclosure of being, I think, which is what I'm aiming at a little bit more. The foreclosure of being itself, of the question of being. Being itself becomes foreclosed, and we only can speak now of particular beings. Being as such becomes foreclosed to us as something that reveals itself in a novel and unique way. We can recognize a simple difference proper to oneness, something and its other, the form of what something is and its actual content. But how does it come to pass that the object of dialectic is itself revealed as one thing, one disclosure of being? Well, why don't we relate this to this issue of socialism? What does socialism mean, for example, for most people? It means, here I am, right? Isn't that the case? It's a shitty, bad world. Everything sucks. And here I am, and I'm sad. Okay. Isn't this a contradiction? Isn't this what we're talking about when we're talking about BreadTube and we're talking about the entire aesthetic of socialists in 2021? Doesn't this ultimately imply a type of arrogance? Hegel, a guy you're probably a little familiar with, the name, he referred to this aesthetic as the aesthetic of a romantic. The romantic is an aesthetic of the unhappy consciousness. The unhappy consciousness, according to Hegel, is an initial encounter with the fact that... And how do they arrive at the conclusion that's a shitty world? Because the world does not reflect what is within them. The world does not reflect the striving, their inner striving to be realized in the world. Instead, they're confronted with a contradiction, and they're confronted with imperfection or whatever, right? Yes, gentle Ginjit, exactly, it's the beautiful soul we're talking about here. The socialist says the solution to this is to change the world. So what is going to happen now? Am I going to be Jordan Peterson and say, no, you have to change? Clean your own bedroom before you want to change the world, bucko. Maybe you just got to change your outlook. Hegel arrives at something that superficially might sound a little similar to this Jordan Peterson thing. For Hegel, the problem with this socialist right here, who bases their entire aesthetic and their identity upon the fact, upon this initial encounter with a contradiction, Hegel says what this person cannot see is how this contradiction, sorry, this looks so bad, this contradiction from here on out is actually proper to the very object, the world itself. What does that mean? It means this. The Anglo-socialists you are familiar with on BreadTube and on YouTube, they are this guy. They think this is a shitty world and the goal is to change the world in that sense. Not in Marx's sense, but in their sense, right? Special sense. They're elevated above the world. They know better in their head the truth, whole truth of being, simply because they have encountered a contradiction. But the contradiction is still purely subjective. Oh boy, this is such a mess. The only source of the contradiction here is the fact that the world does not conform to what the socialist feels is within their very soul. But what Hegel says, according to Hegel, what Hegel says is that to recognize the contradiction as itself objective means that you recognize the difference, the contradiction, as proper to the thing itself, not just something that dwells inside of your heart, but is actually proper to the object itself. The object, the wound, is already reconciled. This is what Hegel means by the wound on the cross. We only see the world as shitty, but we do not include in the world the very contradiction that we experience in a purely subjective way. If we did include the contradiction that we experience purely subjectively as a feature of the object itself, paradoxically, this is the source of an immense reconciliation. Why is that? Because deliverance to the true object is the source of true subjective freedom and, let's say, absolute knowledge. When we recognize the contradiction as proper to the object itself, and not just something that is instantiated subjectively as the difference between ourselves and the world, we put the contradiction to work. We see the contradiction as the object itself, and we see it as something which is the source of a continued development of some kind. The contradiction sets in motion the beginning of work. Why? I gotta clean this mess now. If I accept I will always be lacking in anything, then why pursue anything? Well, what is the object of that you can pursue? If you recognize it's not that you will always be lacking, Daniel. It's that the object itself is lacking. The object itself And why is it lacking? It's only lacking from a subjective perspective. In actual reality, the object is positive in such a way that you subjectively experience it as lacking, but this subjective experience results from a feature, an objective material feature proper to the object itself. Socialism is no longer confined to a little box in our heads forever set against the world. The very contradiction that gives rise to our socialistic subjectivity is recognized to be proper to the object, the world itself. Hence, the world is already socialist. That's what I'm arriving at. This initiates, right here, putting it onto the object itself, reinitiates the dialectic process. What's called in Marxist terms, unleashing the forces of production. You become subjectively attuned to the dialectic of freedom and necessity, and you become delivered to this process of the unleashing of the forces of production. I know I'm being off topic here, but when I hear the word dialectics, the first thing that comes to my mind is different understandings of dialectics. Western versus Eastern Marxists had, which itself is dialectic. Absolutely, absolutely. Guys, all of this comes together. Okay? The East versus West difference is a dialectic. The rural versus urban is a dialectic. Town versus country is a dialectic. Mind versus body is a dialectic. Marxist materialist dialectic means there's a unity of opposites. So it is a search for grounding these contradictions in such a way so as to arrive at their objectivity. The contradiction is itself a material object. The contradiction is itself what is material. That's why I speak of substantialism as Anglo-Saxon 17th century metaphysics. Within substantialism, the thing that is material is already a predefined form of some kind. It's a tangible object in the colloquial sense of our word. It's an object like this water bottle. It's an object like an apple. It's already a predefined form. But the object relevant for dialectics, materialist dialectics, for example, what is so material about the object is not the fact that it is sensuously real, only sensuously real, but that the contradiction reveals itself as objective in a way that cannot be contained, for example, in a previous grounding of the dialectic. The example of this is Hegel's dialectic. Hegel's dialectic attempted to ground the very subjective appreciation of dialectic itself in ultimately one form. Through philosophy. Marx simply continued the dialectic. He said, Hegel, can't you see that in this movement of arriving at absolute knowledge, having exhausted the whole extent of philosophy, in the movement of philosophy, you have merely arrived and commanded, if you will, compelled an encounter with the otherness in actual reality that is the proletariat. The proletariat is the concrete disclosure of a unity of opposites. Namely, and this is kind of separate from dialectics, the proletariat, the one, productive relations, the other. No, the proletariat, Daniel, this is where we must escape the one-sidedness of merely recognizing the dialectic in the form of a contradiction and recognize the contradiction itself to be objective, which means our object is no longer one or the other. Our object is the very essential contradiction for which the distinction between one and other is a secondary expression, subjectively of. Meaning, the proletariat is itself a concrete unity of opposites. The proletariat is itself the concrete unity of opposites. The unity of opposites between what? From the perspective of the universal state, which attempts to premise man by some kind of form, the citizen. The citizen. The proletariat is the living contradiction, the unity of opposites between man and his material, actual, sensuous, Marx, and living reality, and the modern form of citizen. This is the unity of opposites that defines the proletariat. Right? The other is the citizen, and what is the otherness of the citizen? For Hegel, the otherness of the citizen, for example, is the void. Form for Hegel arises forth from the void. For Marx, form does not arise from the void. Form arises from some type of material content, which cannot be preemptively known in thought or subjectively, but which is nonetheless real and material and objective. And in a sense, the bourgeois state, for example, the form of the bourgeois state arises in contradiction to what? The peasantry, right? The rural countryside, the vendee, whatever. The proletariat is the living and concrete manifestation of that contradiction as it's living and persisting. That's why Marx privileges the proletariat and not the peasantry. Marx privileges the proletariat because, for Marx, the dualism of the modern bourgeoisie and the cities and the mass, what Marx calls the mass of the rural poor, for example, this contradiction does not reveal anything to us about what is objective in being itself. It's a one-sided contradiction, right? It's not enough. We need the proletariat to disclose the fact that the contradiction is itself something that is objective and is not just dwelling in a subject who recognizes the difference between town and country, for example, or the mass of the rural poor and the opposite. It's just my best attempt at an intro.